Hi, welcome back to the channel guys. In my last video I removed the boot lid on this 2006 Maserati Quattroporte M139 Duo Select. The other day I removed the rear bumper, so in this video I'm going to show you step by step how I did it. Now the process of removing the boot is pretty straightforward and it should take around an hour. You have to remove lots of things, including the rubber boot seal, the trim in the boot. You need to unfasten the battery and slide it out of the way or remove it completely. Remove both rear light clusters, both rear wheels, and finally the arch liners. For me, the job took around 2 hours, and that's because quite a few of the bolts that fasten the bumper to the car snapped because they didn't have any anti-seize grease on them. In addition to this, all of the bolts used to fasten the arch liners were also seized, so I've had to use a drill and grinder to remove them. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the rubber boot seal, followed by the boot trim. In the plastic tray you can see that there's some water. Now the boot seals are a common cause for water leaks on the Maserati, but in my case the boot lid ended up out of shape when a van drove in the back of me. I use a trim removal tool to remove this cover, which hides 5 of the bumper bolts. Despite being careful, the cover ended up distorted, so I've had to order a new one. All 5 of these Torx bolts were corroded, so I cleaned them up before using a socket with a Torx bit to remove them. I was worried that they may be seized up, but all freed up nicely, and I managed to remove all 5 without any break-in. In fact, you can see here that the actual threads are clean and that the rust was only on the head of the bolts. I'm now going to remove the trim that hides the battery on the right side of the boot. So I undo these bolts and remove the trim clips before lifting the trim out of the boot. Moving across to the left side, I remove these bolts and the trim clips. I've got a 12-volt socket fitted to the left side of the trim, so I disconnect the plug before removing it. Each of the rear light clusters hide 2 bumper bolts. I'll start by removing the one on the left side of the car. I undo the 3 nuts, being careful to retain the washers. The top fastener has the fuel cap pull cord bracket fitted, and you can see the red pull cord here. I now undo the electrical plug used to connect the light cluster to the wiring loom. Lifting the light cluster out of the way, you can see the 2 bumper bolts. With the light cluster protecting the bolts from the elements, they're in a pretty good state. At the bottom of the bumper there are 3 bumper bolts. Mine had 2 that were completely seized and broke off. The other one in the centre was already broken, and I can only assume that it's left like that by whoever worked on the car in the past. There are 2 M6 bolts on both sides of the boot. The left side bolts are accessible without removing anything else. However, on my car, the areas behind the trim are covered in grime which has got in from the side vents. I'm therefore removing the amplifier so I can get access behind the panel to clean it. Here you can see the two bolts which are removed using a ratchet and socket. With the wheel removed on the right side of the car, I now begin the process of removing the arch liner. Now all of the bolts were seized, so I had to use a drill and grinder with a metal cutting disc to remove the heads of the bolts. In a future video I'll be drilling them out and fitting new threaded rivets. To get access to the two bolts behind the battery and the nuts that fasten the light cluster on the right side of the car, I remove the bracket that secures the battery and slide the battery out enough to get access, but being careful not to put tension on the wires. I now use the socket and Torx bit to remove the two bumper bolts. With all the bolts removed, you can now remove the bumper. If you've got parking sensors fitted like me, then you'll need to rest the bumper on some protective matting and undo the plugs on each of the sensors. I think it would have been better if Maserati had used one plug rather than individual plugs on the sensors, so I may consider doing a modification to that in the future. And that's all for today's video. If you would like to see my future Maserati videos and other projects, then please click on the subscribe button. I've also included links to my Maserati playlist in the description of the video below. Thank you for watching. Cheers.